Vampire Count Dracula, one of the main nightmares of modern pop culture. He has supernatural power, feeds on the blood of people, sleeps in a coffin, and ordinary mortals cannot overcome him. But his real prototype, Vlad III, also known as Vlad Dracula or Vlad Tepes, was a legendary voivode and prince of Wallachia. As they say, his reputation during his lifetime was much scarier than the reputation of the legendary vampire Bram Stoker. What if you're 19 and they marry you to Dracula? How did the real Vlad Dracula become so famous that he became the prototype of a vampire? What was their wedding night like? Is it true that vampires come from Slavic mythology? And who really was the first vampire who caused a real panic in Europe in the 18th century? How did vampires attack the USA in the 19th century? Why is Dracula considered a saint in Romania? And what modern descendants of his are very well known to you all? So, what was it like to be married to Vlad Dracula? At that moment, Vlad Dracula was already about 45, and by that age he was a legendary personality. His young bride, who grew up at court, of course, well knew all the terrible gossip about him. She was an extremely religious girl, and everything she heard about her future husband scared her wildly. In a nutshell, all that the vampire Count Dracula is famous for, created by the imagination of Bram Stoker, is nonsense compared to the biography of the real Vlad III. Already during his lifetime, books with legends about his sadistic tendencies and bloodthirstiness were distributed throughout Europe. He was known as a famous warrior, but at the same time everyone had heard about his incredible cruelty and vindictiveness. His enemies, especially the Turks, were desperately afraid of him. As the court gossiped, Dracula liked to dip bread in the blood of enemies at dinner. It was also said that he had a very strange sense of humor. Ostensibly watching the impaled ones, he found it funny that they twitched on the stakes like frogs, and said, "Oh, what great grace they show." He supposedly liked to dine under corpses impaled on a stake, and when the servant serving him at dinner almost fainted from the stench of decomposing bodies, Dracula ordered him to be put on the highest stake. Now, they say, this smell of rot will not reach you. Courtiers also said that this bloodthirsty monster burned vagrants with whom he could sit down to feast. The ambassadors, who did not take off their hats when meeting him, were ordered to nail these hats to their heads, forced parents to eat their own children. Unfaithful wives in his possessions had their genitals cut out, skinned. It was also said that his subjects were so afraid of their lord that in the center of the square there was a golden bowl without guards, from which one could drink and which no one dared to steal. All these stories chilled the blood in Lani in the palace, told during a walk to pass the time. But now she was being offered to marry this monster. She also saw a terrible book about Vlad Dracula with terrifying miniatures called a villain, who was called Dracul and was the governor of Wallachia. Here's what I read in Nylon about the fiercest of the lords, who used to hurt his subjects everywhere since the world was created. About the worst beast of all time, as far as I know. I will tell you in verse how Dracul, spiteful, owned Alahia, and beckoned to strengthen his business with sins. She remembered how everyone sighed with relief that this monster had been in prison for a long time, 13 years, in which King Corwin unexpectedly put him, allegedly for secret negotiations with the Ottoman Empire. And now she was going to marry him. According to the custom adopted during courtship in noble families, the king ordered a portrait that was painted with Dracula in prison. It is unlikely that a man from this portrait could conquer a girl. Bride Dracula was not wearing a white dress at all, but a red dress, so it was supposed to be. The priests of Nat Arya assured their marriage. Then they went to church, where they took vows and received a blessing. And then it was time for another important ceremony. Reclining or consummation of marriage. The wedding night was to be held in public, in the presence of witnesses who closed the curtains on the bed and waited for the marriage to take place. After all, it was necessary to witness physical contact. After the wedding, which Alona practically did not remember from excitement, she and her new husband went to Transylvania, to Dracula's castle. Now she was going to be alone, completely at his mercy. Her imagination was already picturing impaled people under whom she would have to dine and other horrors. Not many castles in Transylvania say that it was there that Dracula lived, but most of them were built after his death. It is known that the famous gentleman was unpretentious in everyday life and did not like luxury. He spent his whole life in military campaigns. His castle was an extremely uncomfortable place, however, like other castles of the Middle Ages. They were very cold, dank, the castle was blown by all the winds, drafts walked along the corridors. It was almost impossible to heat and illuminate all this. However, Alona found beautiful furniture and dishes in the castle. To her relief, upon arrival, her husband did not immediately rush to put someone on his head. They did not eat under the corpses of the executed, and he did not seem to drink the blood of enemies. Upon arrival, he immediately surrounded himself with priests and monks. Alona began to look at her husband more closely. With the word Dracula, we all imagine someone like this or that. What the real Vlad III looked like, in fact, is not known for certain today. His earliest images were caricatures, although they were created during his lifetime, and the task was to denigrate Vlad III. The earliest image of him is considered to be this. Here he is depicted in the form of Pontius Pilate, who is going to judge Christ, but in this life image from the Lilienfeld Monastery, he torments the apostle Andrew the First Scald. The task of these images, to denigrate Vlad III, but the most reliable, according to scientists, is still this portrait, kept in an Austrian castle. Although it is more recent, but it is a copy of an earlier one that has not been preserved, written, so to speak, from nature during the life of the famous lord. But the portrait that has not come down to us, according to the scientist, was painted when Dracula was in prison for Alona. It also underlies this miniature, which is kept in the Museum of Art History in Vienna. In general, not a sinister monster. He really came from a noble family, but Count Dracula was never. This is Bram Stoker, who wrote his famous novel at the end of the 19th century, embellished a little for a red word. Both Dracula and Sepish are nicknames, but his family's real surname is Basarab. Vlad's date of birth is not exactly established, somewhere between 1429th and 1436th years. By the way, the house in which he was born has been preserved in Romania to this day. There, tourists are also shown a fresco of the 15th century, on which, presumably, Dracula's parents. There is nothing so sinister in his nickname Dracula. Vlad inherited it from his father, who was a knight of the Order of the Dragon. This order was created in the 1408th year by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund to fight for the purity of the Christian faith. All his knights wore medallions or pendants with a golden dragon curled into a ring, having received such a medallion and Draco's father. When he became a sovereign in Allah in 1436, he placed this dragon on coins, on his seal, and even on a heraldic shield. So there was a nickname with which his son will go down in history. But Dracula's compatriots did not consider him a vampire. The vampire didn't know a word about her. Vampire comes from the old Slavic ghoul. Yes, get ready to be surprised. Scientists believe that the vampires familiar to us, who drink blood from people, appeared from Slavic folklore. They have been mentioned in Slavic literature since the 14th century. The most vivid legend about vampires flourished not in Transylvania, but in Serbia. But in Transylvania, these creatures are called strigoi at all. But during the life of Vlad Dracula, no one was particularly afraid of vampires. The real obsession with these creatures began much later, in the 18th century. Yes, Eastern Europe was gripped by a real panic. In 1721, two famous cases of vampire attacks in the village occurred in Serbia. Both stories were investigated by government officials, and many documents have been preserved about them. In one Serbian village, the deceased returned 2 weeks after the funeral and asked for food from his son. He refused. He was found dead. Then 8 more neighbors died from blood loss, who told before their death that the deceased came to them and drank blood. An official named from Bold, to whom the villagers complained, ordered the grave to be opened in the presence of a priest. Frightened people saw the ghoul's body untouched by decomposition. It was burned. With this, the mysterious deaths in the village stopped. The second famous vampire was Arnot Pavli. After his death, the villagers began to die en masse, and the survivors said that it was peacocks hunting them. The authorities opened the grave and found a perfectly preserved body and a coffin full of blood, after which we pierced the ghoul with a stake and burned it. The vampire attacks in this village, however, resumed 6 years later. After the death of 12 people on January 12, 1731, an Austrian Dr. Glaser arrived in the village of Medvedci. At first he tried to explain the deaths by natural causes, but when the villagers insisted on exhumation, he was shocked. Many bodies have not decomposed. The doctor called for backup. A commission of military surgeons headed by Johann Flukinger. He conducted an investigation and found out that almost half of the dead from vampires did not rot. By his order, all the restless dead were impaled and burned. After the story with Pavel's vampire, a real hysteria swept through Europe. In the event of an attack, vampires have already been recorded outside Serbia. And around Serbia, they even offered to create a quarantine zone. A whole generation lived in wild fear of vampires. Peasants massively dug up graves in the hall in the dead stakes. In 1749, all the information collected by the authorities was published by the respected French scientist and theologian Antoine Comte. In his treatise, that's what a government official who visited the epicenter of the vampire epidemic told him. I quote, "In these parts it is considered quite common to meet a person who died some time ago. This person returns to the village, sits down at the table with his acquaintances, without saying a word, and makes a sign with his head to one of those present, who inevitably dies after a few days." The Austrian Empress Maria Theresa was forced to send her personal doctor Gerard van Swyn to investigate this case. He went and wrote a whole treatise on the existence of ghosts, in which he came to the conclusion that vampires do not exist. After that, the Empress forbade the graves to be opened and the bodies to be desecrated. So the vampire epidemic ended, but the legends about vampires continued to live. The next epidemic of empiricism broke out already in the 19th century in New England. This is the east coast of the USA. People believed that vampires attacked them and drank their blood. Families of farmers dug up their dead to cut off their heads and then burn the remains. The most famous story is connected with 19-year-old Mercy Brown. She was called the last of the Rhode Island vampires. She died in 1882, and 2 months later her father and their family doctor took out her body and gasped. There was dried blood on her lips, and she was lying not as she was laid in a coffin, but on her side. Her heart was cut out and burned. Farmers called among the symptoms of the mysterious epidemic of empiricism gray skin, as well as blood from the mouth and fallen eyes. But today scientists believe that these symptoms are very similar to the symptoms of tuberculosis, and blood dripped from the mouth after coughing. It is these events that are believed to have given rise to a terrible fear of vampires in modern culture. Well, our Alona's life was slowly getting better. Her husband turned out to be a peaceful man in everyday life and also extremely religious. And in this they found each other. She found out that her husband supported Wallachian Orthodox monasteries and even founded a new one, built a temple, and was engaged in charity. His subjects loved him and were devoted to him. By the the way, there is a version that it was because of Ilona that Dracula broke up with his first wife, who drowned herself because of this near the fortress of Yanner. However, other historians say that the story about the drowned woman is just a legend, recorded by folklore researchers in 1969. And even there it is unclear who drowned himself. It was only she, Dracula, or his daughter, or even a peasant woman who did not want to fall into the hands of the Turks. However, according to another version, he still had his first wife. Her name was Elizabeth, and she was the illegitimate daughter of the previous Hungarian king, with whom Vlad fought. His first wife, Elizabeth, allegedly gave birth to his son Miknia, nicknamed the Evil One, and died. However, only the existence of Ilona is reliably known. Gradually, she learned from her husband his true story. And Dracula was a real knight of the Order of the Dragon, a famous warrior who considered the mission of his life to protect orthodoxy and create a unified state. That's why the prototype of Dracula is a saint today, revered by the Romanian Church. There he is, a national hero. His opponents and even his younger brother spent a huge amount of effort and money to turn this famous commander, brave warrior and talented ruler into a fantastic villain and bloodsucker during his lifetime. Streams of monstrous lies were poured on him, spread all over the world. A real information war, which a brave warrior lost to cunning scoundrels, and remained the greatest villain in history. When he was still very young, Father Dracula took the Wallachian throne by the will of the King of Hungary. Then he quarreled with the king and lost the throne. Well, then the struggle began to regain this throne with the help of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. As a result, your son, Vlad, who was 13 or 14 at the time, and his younger brother Rada were held hostage by the Sultan so that Dracula's father would be, so to speak, a reliable partner. Many researchers believe that it was here, in Turkey, that he experienced the strongest psychological shock. This happened, according to one version, after he was tortured in the Ottoman Empire to convert to Islam. On the other hand, historical sources do not say anything about this. And according to another popular hypothesis, Dracula received the strongest shock when the heir to the throne of the Ottoman Empire, Mehmed II, began to harass his younger brother. A medieval Greek historian writes that Mehmed II was in love with Dracula's brother and Radu beautifully. In general, for sure the life of two young defenseless hostages at the court was not sugar. And then something terrible happened. In 1447, Dracula's father was dethroned, the Hungarians, with the support of local boyars, cut off his head. Mircea older brother was blinded with red-hot iron stakes and buried alive. The Ottoman Sultan, having learned about the death of Dracula's father, declared a new war on the Hungarians and a year later put the 25-year-old Vlad on the throne, and his younger brother, Radu, his lover, left at his court. But, having come to power, Vlad refused to pay tribute to the Turks and became the most implacable fighter against the Ottomans. He strengthened the country's defense with a ring of fortresses, developing trade, pursued a policy of protectionism, ruthlessly fought against traitorous aristocrats, elevating not noble, but loyal people. And after that he marched against the Turks, inflicting a crushing defeat on them. Legends began to form about the exploits in the battles of the young dragon. But when the Turks went to take revenge on the tiny one in Allah and his allies betrayed him, they did not come to the rescue. Vlad's tiny army, about 30,000 people, was left alone against 150,000 on the Turkish side. Then he made a brilliant move. He warned Kutuzov's tactics. His soldiers, retreating into the mountains, burned all the crops in their homeland and poisoned the wells. The Turkish army suffered terrible deprivation along the way, and at the end they were waiting for the abandoned capital in Allah with the gates open. There was not a single living soul here, only captured Turks impaled on the field. And a terrible, suffocating stench. The Ottomans were terrified and hurried away, and at night they were attacked by the Dracula wars. The once invincible Turks fled in disgrace. By the way, with them was his younger brother, Radu, whom the Turkish Sultan wanted to put on the throne in Allah. So Vlad III won another incredible victory. The hammer of the Turks was talked about all over Europe. And that's where he was betrayed once again. First, a friend, the king of Moldavia, whom Vlad helped to win the throne, teamed up with his younger brother and the Turks. And when Vlad turned to the Hungarian king, Ilona's cousin, he completely and unexpectedly arrested Dracula and accused the main fighter in the Balkans against the Turks of having conspired with them. Here is what a contemporary, the author of the Hungarian Chronicle, writes with surprise. The king crossed the Alps, as they say, in order to free Dracula from the hands of the Turks. When he got there, he, I don't know for what reason, because no one quite understood it, captured Dracula in Transylvania. The other, the Rada, appointed to this province by the Turks, contrary to everyone's expectation, approved. The same Dracula was brought to Buda as a prisoner and kept in captivity for 10 years. These are the allies. After Vlad's arrest on the Wallachian throne, the Radu of the beautiful beloved of the Turkish Sultan, who converted to Islam in 1464, launched an information war against his brother. He has published a book about Dracula, in which a new bloodthirsty image of yesterday's brave hero was laid. The most terrible fictions were collected there, terrifying miniatures were given. The book was printed in large circulation and distributed all over the world. How a brave warrior became a sadist and a bloodsucker. By the way, the nickname Sepish, which translates from Romanian as cola planter, was not used at all during the life of Vlad III. It appeared 30 years after his death. The relationship of Dracula Ilona has improved. She was considered childless for a long time due to the fact that she never had children in her first marriage. But in marriage with Dracula, Ilona was desperate, gave birth to 2 sons, one of whom she named after her husband of Vlad. But Dracula still spent most of his time on military campaigns. He died in 1476. Medieval chroniclers Jacob Unrist and Jan Lugash believe that he was a murderous servant bribed by the Turks. And Ilona was married again. No one knows what she thought about it. First she married a certain Pavel Stuka, and after his death, for John Erdley of Transylvania, Ilona died in 1497. She had no children from other husbands. You will be surprised, but the descendants of that very Vlad Dracula live today, and are well known to all of you. These are the heirs to the English throne, Charles and William, and Queen Elizabeth II herself. To quote Prince Charles, "I have Transylvanian blood in my veins. According to the family tree, I descend from Vlad III Tepes." In the 19th century, the British King George V married Maria of Text, who was a direct descendant of Tepes's brother, Vlad IV. Scientists have considered that Prince Charles, descendant of Dracula, in the 16th generation. However, he himself said that he was not afraid of his bloodthirsty relative and even bought a small house in one of the Romanian villages.